"You're fired." Luca Bellucci's emotionless announcement stunned every employee inside the Bellucci Foundation. The curvy librarian hadn't argued, broken a single rule, or even raised her voice, yet the city's most feared mafia boss dismissed her in front of executives, donors, and senior staff without explanation. Grace Donovan simply smiled, thanked him for the opportunity, and walked away with her head held high. Everyone believed that was the end of the story. It wasn't. The very next afternoon, Luca was quietly seen sitting outside the tiny neighborhood library where Grace had just started over. On most mornings, Grace Donovan unlocked the grand oak doors of the Bellucci Foundation Library before sunrise. She loved those quiet minutes before the city awakened. The silence wasn't empty. It carried the scent of aging paper, polished wood, and stories waiting to be opened. To Grace, every shelf felt like an old friend. Some librarians organized books. Grace organized people. She remembered what children liked before they did. She knew which mystery novels helped retired police officers sleep at night. She could recommend history books to nervous college freshmen after hearing only 2 sentences about their assignments. Visitors often joked that the library's computer system wasn't nearly as impressive as Grace's memory. She would only smile. "My system doesn't crash," she'd reply. That answer usually earned a laugh. The library had quietly become one of the most beloved places in the city. Children begged their parents to bring them every Saturday for story hour. Retirees arrived before opening time, simply to chat with Grace for a few minutes. Students claimed her reading recommendations saved entire semesters. Many donors believed the historic building itself was responsible for the library's popularity. Those who came regularly knew better. They came because of the woman behind the front desk. Grace lived by one simple rule: no title makes someone more important than kindness. She never displayed the sentence on a wall. She simply lived it. The janitor received the same warm greeting as wealthy benefactors. A nervous intern was treated with the same respect as a university president. That quiet consistency made people trust her. Unfortunately, not everyone admired that influence. Charlotte Hayes certainly didn't. As director of public relations for the Bellucci Foundation, Charlotte believed appearances created authority. Everything she wore, every word she spoke, every event she organized projected sophistication. She viewed the foundation as a symbol of prestige. Grace viewed it as a place that belonged to everyone. The contrast irritated Charlotte more each passing month. She never openly criticized Grace. That would have looked petty. Instead, she mastered something far more dangerous: polite manipulation. During meetings, she'd smile gently before asking questions that sounded perfectly reasonable. "Are we certain library expenses are being documented properly? I wonder if community programs are producing measurable returns. Perhaps another financial review would reassure our donors." Nobody considered those comments unusual. Except Luca Bellucci. As head of the foundation and leader of the Bellucci syndicate, he listened far more than he spoke. His reputation terrified most people long before they ever met him. Stories painted him as ruthless, cold, impossible to impress. Inside the foundation, employees lowered their voices whenever he entered a room. Grace didn't, not because she was fearless, because she believed everyone deserved normal conversation. Whenever Luca visited the library, she greeted him exactly as she greeted everyone else. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bellucci. Would you like some coffee?" He almost always declined. She always offered anyway. Their conversations rarely lasted longer than a minute. Yet somehow, she became one of the only people in the foundation who spoke to him without trying to flatter him. Luca noticed. He never mentioned it. 3 weeks before the board meeting, an internal audit uncovered something disturbing. Several financial records connected to the library had been altered. Invoices had been changed. Digital signatures had been copied. Approval records no longer matched archived files. At first glance, the evidence pointed directly toward Grace Donovan. Luca refused to believe it. Grace had managed community projects worth millions of dollars over the years. Not once had anyone questioned her honesty. He quietly ordered a deeper investigation. The results disturbed him even more. Someone hadn't merely created false records. Someone had carefully built an entire trail designed to destroy Grace's reputation. Every forged document pushed investigators toward the same conclusion: Grace Donovan. The investigation remained secret. If whoever created the evidence discovered they were being watched, they would disappear. Or worse, they would accelerate their plan. Luca made a decision almost nobody would understand. Grace had to leave the foundation immediately, not because she was guilty, because she was the target. The monthly board meeting arrived on a bright Thursday morning. Department heads filled the conference room. Donors occupied the front rows. Senior executives reviewed financial reports while assistants distributed coffee. Grace stood near the presentation screen, ready to introduce her newest literacy initiative. She had spent weeks preparing it. Her proposal would deliver thousands of donated books to neighborhoods where children had little access to libraries. The first few slides received approving nods. Several board members smiled. Then Luca spoke. "Miss Donovan." Grace looked toward him. "Yes, Mr. Bellucci?" His expression remained unreadable. "Your employment with the Bellucci Foundation ends today." The room froze. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Grace stared at him for several long seconds. Confusion flickered across her face, but anger never appeared. She slowly closed her presentation folder. "May I ask why?" "No." His answer was immediate. "Professional." Final. For a heartbeat, everyone expected an argument. Instead, Grace nodded gently. "I understand." She gathered her notes with calm, practiced movements. Then she looked around the room. "It has been a privilege serving this library." She smiled at several volunteers sitting near the back. "Everything for next month's reading program has already been organized. The instructions are labeled by color. You'll be fine." Someone lowered their eyes. Another employee quietly wiped away tears. Grace walked toward the exit without another word. Her dignity somehow made the moment even more painful. The heavy doors closed behind her. Only then did whispers spread across the conference room. What happened? Did she break policy? Was there misconduct? Charlotte sighed softly. What an unfortunate situation. She lowered her eyes with carefully rehearsed sympathy. Sometimes, difficult decisions are necessary to maintain excellence. Several executives nodded. The explanation sounded believable. Luca remained silent. Because only he knew the truth. He had just sacrificed the trust of the one employee who had never once asked anything from him. As everyone slowly left the room, he remained seated. His chief of security approached. "She's gone." Luca stared at the empty chair Grace had occupied moments earlier. "Keep surveillance on her." The man frowned. "Protection?" "Yes." "Should she know?" Luca stood. "No. If everything goes as planned, she must believe she simply lost her job." Outside the foundation, Grace stepped into the afternoon sunlight, carrying a single cardboard box. Inside were family photographs, a favorite mug, and a stack of handwritten reading lists prepared for children who would now never receive them from her. She looked back at the magnificent library one last time, then quietly whispered to herself, "Well, I suppose it's time for a new chapter." Grace Donovan spent exactly one evening feeling sorry for herself. She allowed herself a bowl of chocolate ice cream, an old romantic comedy, and one dramatic conversation with her best friend Olivia. By 9 o'clock that night, she placed the empty bowl in the sink, tied her hair into a loose ponytail, and opened her laptop. If one library doesn't want me, she shrugged. Another one probably does. Olivia blinked. That's your recovery process? Grace smiled. What else am I supposed to do? Write an angry letter? No. I'd rather update my resume. By noon the following day, Grace had submitted applications to 6 libraries across the city. Only one replied immediately. It wasn't prestigious. It wasn't famous. In fact, the Maple Street Community Library occupied a renovated grocery store, tucked between a bakery and a family-owned flower shop. The salary was lower. The shelves were older. Half the reading chairs didn't match. Grace accepted the job without hesitation. I'll start tomorrow. The first thing Grace noticed was how quiet the little library felt. Not peaceful. Lonely. The shelves held wonderful books, but very few visitors wandered between them. At the front desk sat an elderly librarian with silver hair tied into a perfect bun. She looked over her glasses. You must be Grace. Grace smiled warmly. And you must be Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. The older woman laughed. I haven't introduced myself. You didn't need to. The director mentioned you during our phone call. Mrs. Brooks narrowed her eyes. I think we're going to get along. By lunchtime, Grace already knew the names of every volunteer. By closing time, she had memorized the children's section. 3 days later, she knew nearly every regular visitor. Grace never believed libraries became popular because of expensive buildings. They became popular because people felt welcomed. She rearranged the reading corner so grandparents could sit beside children instead of across the room. She placed mystery novels near comfortable chairs instead of tall shelves. She created handwritten recommendation cards. If you loved this, try this one. Children began dragging their parents inside after school. Teenagers discovered manga collections hidden in forgotten boxes. A local book club moved its weekly meetings into the library cafe. Within 2 weeks, people who had never visited Maple Street Library before began arriving every afternoon. Then every morning. Then every weekend. Word spread surprisingly fast. There's a librarian there who remembers everyone's favorite books. She recommended the perfect novel. She somehow knows exactly what you'll enjoy. Even local newspapers noticed. One article called Grace, the librarian who knows you better than your streaming service. Grace laughed for nearly 5 minutes after reading that headline. Across town, someone else was also reading it. Luca Bellucci quietly folded the newspaper. His security chief stood nearby. She's adjusting well. Luca nodded once. Any incidents? None. The people watching her say she's happier than expected. A strange feeling settled over Luca. Relief, mixed with something he didn't care to identify. The investigation inside the foundation continued. Every week uncovered another forged document. Every week strengthened one conclusion. Grace had never stolen $1. Someone had carefully planned to destroy her. Unfortunately, they still hadn't identified who. Until then, Grace remained safer away from the foundation. That should have been enough. It wasn't. The following afternoon, a black luxury sedan stopped across the street from Maple Street Library. Luca remained inside for nearly 5 minutes. You can leave, sir, his driver suggested. Luca looked toward the entrance. I need a book. The driver glanced into the rearview mirror. You've never voluntarily entered a library. I've entered one before. You own it. Luca ignored the comment. He stepped onto the sidewalk. The small bell above the library door chimed softly. Grace looked up from arranging returned books. For a brief second, she genuinely thought she was imagining things. Luca Bellucci stood in the middle of the tiny library, wearing a tailored charcoal suit worth more than the building's monthly budget. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Grace smiled politely. Good afternoon, Mr. Bellucci. He inclined his head. Miss Donovan. An awkward silence followed. Mrs. Brooks watched from behind the circulation desk with obvious curiosity. Luca slowly approached. "I'd like to borrow a book." "Of course." Grace folded her hands. "What kind of book are you looking for?" He hesitated, long enough that Grace realized he had absolutely no idea. "Gardening." She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Gardening." Grace stared at him. "You own helicopters?" "Yes." "You don't own a garden." Luca considered that. "I might someday." Mrs. Brooks suddenly coughed into her hand, very loudly. Grace suspected it was hiding laughter. She walked toward the gardening section. "I'm afraid our gardening collection is rather small." "That's acceptable." She handed him a beginner's guide filled with photographs of tomato plants. Luca accepted it with complete seriousness. "I'll take this." Grace couldn't help smiling. "I hope your imaginary garden does well." "So do I." The next afternoon, he came back. Grace looked at the returned book. "You finished it already?" "Yes." "What did you learn?" Luca paused. "Water is important." Mrs. Brooks abruptly disappeared into the staff room. A muffled laugh echoed through the hallway. Grace bit her lip. "I see. Would you like another book?" "Yes." "What subject?" He looked toward the shelves. "Bird watching." Grace slowly folded her arms. "Do you own birds now?" "No." "Planning to?" "Possibly." She handed him a field guide with a perfectly straight face. "I wish you success." Then he returned again, and again, and again. One day it was cooking, the next day astronomy, then classic poetry, then beginner woodworking. Books he clearly had no intention of reading. Sometimes he finished 400 pages overnight. Sometimes he returned books that still had the bookmark on page 12. Grace noticed. She simply never mentioned it. Instead, she began choosing books she genuinely thought he might enjoy. Historical biographies, leadership memoirs, detective novels. He checked them out without complaint. For reasons he couldn't explain, those books actually stayed open longer than the gardening manuals. One rainy afternoon, Grace looked up from stamping return dates. "So?" Luca glanced toward her. "So? I've been curious." He waited. "You fired me." "Yes." "Now you visit my library almost every day." "Yes." She leaned slightly across the counter. "Should I be worried?" For the first time, Luca hesitated. "No. You should expect recommendations." Grace smiled. "Good." "I was afraid this was becoming a very expensive book club." Something unexpectedly happened. The corner of Luca's mouth lifted. Barely. Just enough to resemble the beginning of a smile. Mrs. Brooks noticed. She quietly whispered to a volunteer, "I don't believe that man has ever smiled before." The volunteer whispered back, "I think the librarian is repairing him." Grace, completely unaware of the conversations happening around her, stamped another return slip. "Your due date is next Thursday." Luca accepted the book. "I'll return it." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Hopefully on time." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll do my best." As he walked toward the exit, Mrs. Brooks watched him through the front window until he disappeared into the waiting sedan. Then she turned to Grace. "My dear." Grace looked up. "I believe that man is borrowing books for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with reading." Grace laughed. "Oh, Mrs. Brooks, you're reading far too many romance novels." Mrs. Brooks smiled knowingly. "No, dear. I think you aren't reading enough." By the beginning of the third week, Luca Bellucci had become the Maple Street Library's most predictable mystery. Every Tuesday, every Thursday, every Saturday, at precisely 3:15 in the afternoon, a black luxury sedan appeared across the street. 3 minutes later, the front door chimed. Grace barely looked up anymore. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bellucci." "Good afternoon, Miss Donovan." The exchange had become so routine that children no longer whispered when he entered. Instead, they simply moved aside so the tall man in the expensive suit could reach the circulation desk. Only newcomers still stared. Regular visitors had accepted an unusual truth. The city's most feared mafia boss had somehow become one of the library's most consistent patrons. Not everyone found the situation mysterious. Luca's security team certainly didn't. Inside the sedan, parked half a block away, 4 bodyguards watched their boss disappear into the library yet again. Marco checked his watch. 3 minutes. Tony grinned. "What are we betting today?" "History." "No." "Cooking." "I say, romance." Marco laughed. "Our boss? Our boss?" "Impossible." Tony shrugged. Last week he borrowed poetry. Nothing is impossible anymore. The youngest guard pulled out his phone. "I've started keeping statistics." Marco turned around. "Statistics?" "Books borrowed. Visit length. Number of times he pretends he doesn't know where the shelves are." Tony burst into laughter. "You actually made a spreadsheet." "I like data." Marco shook his head. "We protect the most dangerous man in the city. And somehow we've become librarians." Inside, Grace handed Luca another returned receipt. "You've been very responsible lately." "I've improved. You haven't paid a late fee in almost 2 weeks." "I dislike penalties." Grace smiled knowingly. "I'll remember that." Luca nodded without realizing those words would soon become important. Mrs. Brooks observed everything from the front desk. She had worked in libraries for 42 years. She had witnessed shy teenagers fall in love between bookshelves. She had watched elderly couples hold hands while reading newspapers. She recognized quiet affection long before the people involved did. Grace, however, remained completely oblivious. One afternoon, Mrs. Brooks finally asked, "My dear," Grace looked up. "Has it occurred to you that Mr. Bellucci may not actually care about gardening?" Grace laughed. "He returned that book days ago. And now? Today he's borrowing architecture." Mrs. Brooks tilted her head. "Does he own buildings?" Grace blinked. "Actually, he owns quite a lot of buildings." The older woman sighed dramatically. "There goes my theory." Luca's visits slowly change. At first, he came only to borrow books. Now, sometimes he stayed. He would sit near the tall windows overlooking Maple Street. A book remained open in his hands. Whether he read more than a few pages was another matter. Grace occasionally noticed him staring outside instead. One rainy afternoon, a little girl approached his table. "Mister?" Luca looked up. "Yes?" "My book is too high." She pointed toward the top shelf. Without a word, Luca stood, retrieved the colorful picture book, and handed it to her. "Thank you." She smiled brightly before running away. Grace watched the entire exchange. "You handled that well. I've negotiated with adults. Children are less intimidating." Grace laughed. "I don't think most parents would agree." The atmosphere inside the library felt lighter whenever Luca visited. Oddly enough, not because of him, because of Grace. She never treated him like a mafia boss. She corrected him whenever he misplaced books. She reminded him about library rules. She once gently scolded him for folding the corner of a page. "No," Grace carefully unfolded it. "We use bookmarks." "I'll remember. You said that last week." "Did I? You also forgot." Mrs. Brooks nearly dropped an entire stack of novels, trying not to laugh. Meanwhile, the investigation inside the Bellucci Foundation reached a turning point. Late one evening, Luca sat alone in his office reviewing security footage from several weeks earlier. Frame after frame, invoice after invoice. One image caught his attention. Charlotte Hayes, alone. Inside the accounting archive after midnight, She had claimed to be attending a charity dinner that evening. The timestamp proved otherwise. His chief investigator quietly entered. "We've confirmed another forged authorization." Signed? Grace Donovan. Luca closed the file. Except she wasn't in the building. No. There are security logs. There are witness statements. There are digital edits. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. Charlotte hadn't simply disliked Grace. She had built an elaborate trap. They still needed undeniable proof. But they were getting closer. Very close. The next Saturday afternoon, the library buzzed with unusual energy. A local reading club had gathered near the fireplace. Teenagers occupied nearly every study table. Children built castles from oversized picture books. Grace moved effortlessly from one conversation to another, helping, laughing, remembering names. Luca sat quietly in his favorite chair. This time, he wasn't pretending to read. He actually was. Grace noticed the book cover while walking past. She stopped, looked again, then smiled. A romance novel? Luca slowly raised his eyes. Yes. She folded her arms. I thought mafia bosses only read strategy books. Without looking away from the page, he answered, I'm researching negotiation. Grace blinked. With kissing, silence. Mrs. Brooks froze behind the circulation desk. Several teenagers nearby suddenly became very interested in the conversation. Luca calmly closed the novel. Especially that chapter. For exactly 1 second, nobody reacted. Then the entire library erupted into laughter. Even the teenagers applauded. Mrs. Brooks leaned against the counter because she was laughing too hard to stand properly. Grace covered her mouth. I cannot believe you just said that. Neither could Luca. His ears turned faintly red. Marco, watching through the library window from the parked sedan outside, stared in disbelief. Did the boss just make a joke? Tony looked equally shocked. I think he flirted. The youngest guard immediately opened his spreadsheet. New category. Marco frowned. What category? Successful attempts at humor. You're impossible. And so is this. From that day forward, rumors spread faster than any official announcement. Employees inside the Bellucci Foundation whispered during coffee breaks. Have you heard? The boss spends every week at a neighborhood library. Apparently, he keeps borrowing books. I heard he smiled. No, that's impossible. I swear someone has a photograph. Charlotte heard those rumors too. At first, she dismissed them. Then more reports arrived. Then donors casually mentioned Grace's growing popularity. Then, newspapers published another article praising the Maple Street Library's remarkable transformation. Charlotte's smile slowly disappeared. Grace Donovan wasn't supposed to recover. She certainly wasn't supposed to become more admired than before. Charlotte looked at the invitation, resting on her desk. The Foundation's annual charity gala. Hundreds of influential guests would attend. Politicians, business leaders, journalists, donors. A perfect stage. She quietly adjusted the guest list, then added one final name, Grace Donovan. If Grace wanted to enjoy her new little library, Charlotte intended to remind everyone exactly why she'd been dismissed. Charlotte leaned back in her chair. A satisfied smile returned. This time, everyone will believe the story. She had no idea. The truth was already catching up with her. The Bellucci Foundation's annual Legacy Gala was the most anticipated charity event of the year. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the grand ballroom. A string quartet played softly beneath painted ceilings. Journalists stood beside television cameras. Business leaders, university presidents, judges, politicians and long-time donors filled the room with polished conversations and carefully practiced smiles. Every guest believed they were attending a celebration. Very few realized they were about to witness the collapse of a carefully constructed lie. Charlotte Hayes moved gracefully from table to table. Everything appeared flawless. The decorations, the speeches, the media coverage. Even the evening's schedule had been rehearsed down to the minute. She felt completely in control. Her final touch had been adding one unexpected guest to the invitation list, Grace Donovan. Not because Charlotte wanted to welcome her, because she wanted everyone to remember why Grace had disappeared. Public humiliation, Charlotte believed, was most effective when delivered politely. Grace almost declined the invitation. She had no reason to return. Olivia certainly thought she shouldn't. Why would you go? Grace slipped into a simple navy blue evening dress. Because the volunteers invited me. They've been my friends for years. I'm not going for the foundation. I'm going for them. Olivia sighed. You're a better person than I am. Grace smiled. I've had practice. When Grace entered the ballroom, conversations briefly paused. Many former co-workers immediately walked over to greet her. Children from the Foundation's literacy program ran toward her with excited smiles. Several elderly patrons hugged her warmly. Even donors who barely knew her remembered her name. Charlotte noticed every single interaction. Each smile directed toward Grace felt like another personal defeat. Across the ballroom, Luca Bellucci quietly watched. His expression remained unreadable. But unlike previous public appearances, he wasn't watching the crowd. He was watching Grace. She looked exactly as she always had. Calm, kind, comfortable, making everyone else feel welcome. She had no idea tonight would change everything. The evening progressed smoothly. Awards were presented. Scholarships announced. Videos celebrated another successful year for the Foundation. Finally, Charlotte stepped onto the stage. She accepted the microphone with effortless confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been another extraordinary year. Applause echoed politely. She continued. Our foundation has grown stronger because we've remained committed to excellence. She paused dramatically. Sometimes excellence requires difficult decisions. A large photograph of the Foundation library appeared on the projection screen. Charlotte smiled sympathetically. As many of you remember, we were forced to make significant staffing changes this year. Several guests glanced toward Grace, standing quietly near the back of the ballroom. Charlotte lowered her voice. Unfortunately, some employees simply failed to meet the standards expected by this institution. Silence spread through the room. Grace didn't react. She simply folded her hands in front of her. She had learned long ago, not every accusation deserved an immediate answer. Charlotte mistook that silence for surrender. She continued, Our responsibility has always been protecting the Foundation's integrity. She smiled. And I believe history has proven those decisions were necessary. Before she could continue, another voice interrupted. History hasn't. Every head turned. Luca Bellucci slowly rose from his chair. The ballroom became perfectly silent. Nobody interrupted Luca Bellucci. Ever. Charlotte's confident smile faded. Luca. He walked toward the stage without looking at her. When he reached the podium, he calmly extended his hand. The microphone. Charlotte hesitated, then reluctantly handed it over. Luca faced the audience. His voice remained calm, measured, precise. For weeks. The Foundation has conducted a confidential investigation into financial fraud. Whispers spread across the ballroom. Charlotte felt her heartbeat quicken. Luca continued. Tonight, the investigation is complete. He looked toward the accounting department. Display Exhibit 1. The projection screen changed. Digital security logs appeared. Dates,
Times, electronic access records. Exhibit 2. Another document replaced the first. Surveillance photographs, accounting reports, internal authorization records. The audience leaned forward. Luca spoke without emotion. Every allegation made against Grace Donovan was false. The room fell completely silent. He didn't stop. The financial evidence was fabricated. The signatures were forged. The accounting trail was intentionally manipulated. Gasps echoed across the ballroom. Charlotte's face turned pale. No, that's impossible. Luca ignored her. Display the archive footage. Video filled the enormous screen. Charlotte entered the accounting office after midnight. Charlotte accessing confidential files. Charlotte editing records. Charlotte copying authorization forms. Frame after frame, date after date. There was no explanation left, only evidence. Charlotte stumbled backward. You don't understand. I was protecting the foundation. No. Luca's voice remained steady. You were protecting yourself. Security officers quietly approached. Charlotte looked desperately around the room. Nobody defended her. Not one executive. Not one donor. Not one employee. The silence she had once used against Grace had finally turned against her. She lowered her head. For the first time in years, she had nothing left to say. The officers escorted her from the ballroom. No applause followed. Only silence. Luca remained standing before hundreds of guests. Then, he did something nobody expected. He stepped down from the stage, walked across the ballroom, past executives, past politicians, past television cameras. He stopped directly in front of Grace. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The room held its breath. Finally, Luca looked directly into her eyes. I owe you an apology. Nothing more. No excuses, no speech, no attempt to justify what he had done. Just 5 honest words. Grace studied him quietly. Then, she smiled. I've been waiting. Relief flickered across Luca's face. It lasted exactly 1 second. Grace slowly folded her arms. So, you fired me? Yes. You secretly followed me to another library? Yes. You borrowed 12 books? Yes. And somehow? She tilted her head. You still managed to return 3 of them late. For 1 heartbeat. The ballroom remained silent. Then laughter exploded through the room. Even journalists laughed. Several executives covered their faces. Mrs. Brooks, seated beside the volunteers, laughed so hard she nearly dropped her glasses. For the first time anyone could remember. Luca Bellucci smiled without restraint. I'll pay the late fees. Grace pretended to think about it. She looked wonderfully serious. That's not enough. The audience immediately quieted again. Luca nodded. What do I owe? Grace answered with perfect composure. Dinner. The room erupted into applause before Luca could respond. Someone whistled. Several volunteers cheered. Children from the literacy program began clapping enthusiastically. Luca looked at Grace, then gave a single respectful nod. That penalty seems entirely fair. Grace laughed. I thought you'd say that. The applause lasted nearly a full minute. For the first time all evening, nobody was celebrating the foundation. They were celebrating justice. The applause inside the ballroom continued long after the cameras stopped recording. For years, people had admired Luca Bellucci because they respected his power. Tonight, they respected something else. His willingness to admit he had been wrong. Not privately, not behind closed doors, but before every person whose opinion mattered. Grace understood how difficult that had been. She also understood something even more important. An apology meant little unless it was followed by change. Fortunately, Luca seemed to understand that too. The following Monday morning,
Grace received a formal invitation to Luca's office. This time, she wasn't nervous. She knocked gently before entering. Luca stood as soon as she walked inside. No assistants, no executives, no lawyers, just the two of them. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Please." Grace sat comfortably. She looked around the familiar office. "I have to admit, it's much less intimidating when nobody fires me." For a brief moment, Luca almost smiled. "I'll consider that progress." Grace nodded. "I will too." He placed a folder on the desk between them. "I'd like to offer you a position." She didn't reach for it immediately. "What kind of position?" "Director of Community Education for the Bellucci Foundation." Grace remained quiet. Luca continued. "You would oversee every literacy program, every public library partnership, every educational outreach project. You'd have complete authority over community initiatives." Grace finally opened the folder. The offer was generous. The salary exceeded anything she had ever imagined. The resources could transform countless lives. She closed it again. "I have one condition." Luca looked at her. "I'm listening." Grace smiled softly. "The Maple Street Community Library will receive permanent funding." Luca didn't hesitate. "Done." She blinked. "You didn't even ask how much." "I don't need to. If you believe it's necessary, so do I." Grace studied him for a long moment, then extended her hand across the desk. "I accept," instead of shaking her hand immediately. Luca looked at it for half a second, then took it carefully. Not like a business agreement, more like a promise. The announcement spread across the city within hours. Newspapers praised Grace's return. Community leaders celebrated the Foundation's renewed commitment to public education. The Maple Street Library received enough funding to renovate its reading rooms, expand its children's collection, and hire additional staff. Mrs. Brooks celebrated by baking 3 apple pies. Nobody knew why 3. She insisted 1 simply wasn't enough. Months passed. Grace transformed her new department exactly as she had transformed every library she had ever touched. Reading festivals doubled in attendance. Mobile libraries traveled into underserved neighborhoods. Scholarship programs expanded. Children who had never owned a single book began building home libraries of their own. Whenever reporters asked how she achieved so much, Grace always gave the same answer. "You start by remembering people. The books come afterward." Luca kept another promise. He continued visiting Maple Street Library every week. Officially, he claimed he wanted to support local literacy programs. Nobody believed him. Least of all Mrs. Brooks. Whenever his black sedan appeared outside, she'd quietly whisper, "Our most reliable customer has arrived." The volunteers would smile. Someone usually started a timer. Not because they doubted he'd borrow another book, because they wondered how long it would take before Grace caught him pretending to understand it. One Thursday afternoon, Grace walked through the fiction section, carrying a stack of returned novels. She stopped. Luca sat in his favorite chair near the window. A thick novel rested across his chest. His eyes were closed. The book hadn't moved for quite some time. Grace quietly approached. She gently lifted the novel from his hands. He still didn't open his eyes. She glanced at the bookmark. It remained exactly where it had been 45 minutes earlier. Grace smiled. "So?" No response. She tried again. "Finish chapter 3. Without opening his eyes, Luca answered, "I was thinking." Grace looked at the untouched page. For 45 minutes. It was. He searched for an explanation. A complicated sentence. Several children sitting nearby immediately burst into giggles. Mrs. Brooks looked over her glasses. "I've read that book. There aren't any complicated sentences." Luca finally opened one eye. "I may have been reflecting." Grace laughed. On punctuation. Very deeply. The children laughed even harder. As the laughter faded, Grace returned the novel to his hands. "You're lucky." "Oh? You still have borrowing privileges." Luca looked up. "I was unaware they were in danger. They always are. What determines my eligibility?" Grace folded her arms with playful seriousness. "Regular reading." "I see. And returning books on time." "I've improved." "You have." She smiled. "I'm proud of you." Luca looked genuinely pleased by those 4 words. Mrs. Brooks quietly leaned toward a nearby volunteer. "I've watched kings receive less meaningful compliments." Late that afternoon, the library gradually emptied. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting warm patterns across the wooden floor. Children waved goodbye. Parents thanked Grace for another wonderful day. The last volunteer locked the meeting room. Silence slowly returned. Grace stood beside the front desk, organizing tomorrow's reading schedule. Luca helped place several returned books onto a cart. His shelving skills were improving. Slowly. Very slowly. Grace watched him place a biography between 2 mystery novels. She sighed dramatically. "Wrong shelf." He looked at the labels. "I was close. You were in the correct building." He quietly moved the book. "Better?" "Much." He looked at her. "I've learned something." Grace tilted her head. "Only one thing. Today. I'm listening." Luca smiled. "The city says I built an empire." Grace waited. "They're mistaken." "Oh?" He stepped closer. "I lost that battle." Grace couldn't hide her smile. "What defeated you?" He reached gently for her hand. Not hurriedly. Not dramatically. Simply because it felt natural. "No." He shook his head. "Not what?" "Who?" He looked directly into her eyes. "The librarian." Grace squeezed his hand. "And are you planning to surrender?" Luca answered without hesitation. "I already did." Outside the library windows, the afternoon sun settled slowly behind the city skyline. Inside, shelves filled with stories surrounded 2 people who had discovered something neither power nor wealth could ever purchase. Trust, respect, and a love that had begun not with grand declarations, but with borrowed books. The children who had forgotten their backpacks rushed back through the front door, laughing loudly enough to break the quiet. Grace smiled. "Duty calls." Luca glanced toward the bookshelf beside him. "I suppose I'd better finish chapter 3. Grace laughed. "That would be a historic achievement." He picked up the novel. "I have an excellent librarian." "You certainly do." The little bell above the entrance chimed once more as another reader stepped inside. For Grace, it sounded like the beginning of another ordinary afternoon. For Luca, it sounded like coming home.